In 1923, down in the low ground of Richmond, where the city pressed itself against the river and the mud never seemed to dry for long, crews were cutting into a landscape that had flooded for generations. Shockoe Creek was being forced into a concrete box. Earth was being moved, old edges were being exposed, and in a district already layered with fire, commerce, disease, and rumor, something about that work would have felt deeply wrong to anyone paying attention. Because this part of Richmond has a habit of keeping two versions of itself at once. There is the city you can walk today, brick storefronts, traffic lights, sidewalks, delivery doors, restaurants, offices, tourists stepping over history without noticing it. And then there is the other Richmond, the one still sitting lower than the one above it, the one hinted at by full-height doorways that now open into walls of earth, by basement windows that were clearly never meant to be basements, by stone curbs that still trace the edge of a street that officially is no longer there. That is the mystery. Not a collapsed tunnel, not a Hollywood catacomb, something stranger because it is visible in plain sight. Beneath downtown Richmond are doorways built for human traffic at human scale, facing a street line that appears to have been buried. In places, the curbstones still survive. You can still read the geometry. A curb, a threshold, a facade, a street-facing entrance, except the street is gone. And once you see that, the official comfort starts to crack, because if these were only cellars, why do some of them read like storefronts? If this was always below grade, why do the proportions feel wrong? Why do some openings look like they belong to a city that stood several feet lower than the one above it now? And if Richmond really did build over older ground levels in stages, then what else got sealed behind brick, fill, retaining walls, highway ramps, flood projects, and polite historical summaries? This is where the story stops being local curiosity and becomes something heavier. Richmond is one of the oldest urban landscapes in the United States. It has burned, flooded, been rebuilt, terraced, graded, cut through, paved over, and reorganized by railroads, canals, and highways. Whole districts have been redefined by infrastructure. Creeks were boxed, canal sections were filled, foundations were buried. Historic lots were altered so many times that the modern street can feel less like the original city and more like a lid placed over it. So tonight, we are not just looking at buried doorways, we are looking at evidence that downtown Richmond may still be standing over an older street line, an older ground line, and possibly an older version of the city that official memory mentions only in fragments. And the deeper you follow that line, the more disturbing the question becomes. Did Richmond simply grow upward the way old cities often did? Or was part of its past not just abandoned, but deliberately sealed into silence? To understand why this matters, you have to start with the landscape itself. Shockoe Bottom and the surrounding downtown lowlands were never stable ground in the clean modern sense. This was a meeting place of water, trade, and exposure. Shockoe Creek once ran through the valley toward the James River. The land around it was flood-prone, low, uneven, muddy, valuable but difficult, the kind of terrain where every generation solves a problem by changing the ground beneath the next one. That matters because cities do not bury full-height architecture for no reason. They do it when they are desperate, when the old grade no longer works, when floodwater keeps coming, when drainage fails, when commerce demands flatter movement, when rebuilding after disaster is faster than excavating everything back to its original line, and Richmond had no shortage of disasters. The district was repeatedly inundated. One of the earliest documented floods goes back to the 17th century. The flood of 1771 was catastrophic. Later came more inundation, more damage, more rebuilding, more reasons to alter what sat at the lowest edge of the city. Then came the 1865 evacuation fire, which devastated huge portions of old Richmond and forced rapid reconstruction. Then railroads expanded, canal edges changed, industrial needs reshaped entire blocks. That is the official explanation in its safest form. The ground changed because the city had to survive. And to be fair, that explanation is not fantasy. It is supported by the record. Shockoe Creek was eventually enclosed in a concrete box in the 1920s. Canal sections were filled. Historic plans show a district constantly being adapted to water and transport. Archaeology in Shockoe has also shown something crucial. The original landscape did not sit flat. In one important site, investigators found a massive brick retaining wall separating upper and lower terraces with roughly 8 feet of elevation difference across the property. Stop there for a second. An 8-foot difference. That means the buried feeling people get in this district is not just imagination. Vertical change is part of the documented physical history of the area. And once that fact is on the table, those doorways hit differently. Because what do full-height openings really mean when they appear trapped below the modern sidewalk line? What do visible curbstones mean when they sit beside spaces now treated as lower levels, service spaces, or dead zones? At some point, what looks like a basement starts reading like a former first floor. What looks like a sunken vault starts reading like a street edge left behind. And this is where witnesses, photographers, explorers, and urban memory start to matter. Again and again, people in old American cities stumble across the same unsettling detail. Buildings whose lower levels do not feel auxiliary, they feel displaced. The proportions are too generous, the masonry is too finished, the entrances are too public-facing. In Richmond, that impression gets amplified by the topography, the flood history, the canal history, and the strange survival of curb lines where no active street should be. So maybe the mystery is not whether there was an older level. Maybe the mystery is how much of it remains intact and why the surviving clues still feel more visible to ordinary observers than to the official story.
Now let the image sharpen. You are standing in downtown Richmond, and instead of seeing a modern street as finished, you start reading it as a surface laid over an earlier city. Suddenly, the architecture begins to separate into layers. The top line belongs to the Richmond everyone knows. The lower line belongs to a Richmond that still refuses to disappear. That is where the doorways become more than odd design. A true basement entrance usually announces itself as secondary: narrower opening, utility function, delivery logic, compressed ceiling height. But some of the buried-looking openings in older districts carry a different energy. They look like they were meant to meet pedestrians face to face. They look civic, commercial, intended to be seen. Then you notice the curbstones. Not decoration, not random stone, curbstones, the hard edge of a traffic boundary, the language of a street. And that is the part that is hard to explain away once you really sit with it. A curb tells you there was movement. A facade tells you there was frontage. A doorway tells you there was access. Put all three together, and you're no longer looking at an abstract lower level. You're looking at urban orientation. You're looking at a structure that faced a world now missing. So where did that world go? Maybe under fill that was poured for reasons and then forgotten by memory. Maybe behind walls built after floods or after fire, or after the city decided it was easier to build over a problem than to keep explaining it. That possibility changes the temperature of the case, because a buried street is not just missing masonry, it is missing routine, missing footsteps, missing deliveries, missing voices, missing a day that used to happen at a level now treated as underground, as if life itself had been demoted beneath the version of Richmond. The easy answer is fill, regrading, flood control, reconstruction, infrastructure. And yes, that may account for a great deal, but easy answers only go so far when a city begins stacking contradictions on top of each other. Richmond did not just experience natural change, it experienced administrative change, economic change, selective preservation, selective demolition. In the 1950s, the Richmond-Petersburg Turnpike tore through historic ground and buried the foundations of major sites tied to the city's most painful history. That matters because once a city proves it is willing to cover foundations in the name of progress, the psychological barrier is gone. Burial stops sounding accidental. And the pattern gets darker. Creek routes vanish into concrete, canal traces fade under later systems, lots are cut, raised, terraced, or erased. The map becomes cleaner, the ground becomes less honest. Meanwhile, the surviving buildings keep telling on the process. They keep exposing seams, misaligned entrances, windows that sit too low, facades that seem to belong to another grade, masonry transitions that whisper that a once visible level is now restrained by fill, not destroyed, not mythologized, just pressed below the threshold of normal attention. That may be the most unsettling part of all. The evidence does not always hide in remote caves or forbidden archives. Sometimes it sits downtown in business districts, behind parked cars and restaurant signs, waiting for someone to ask why a human-sized doorway is staring into dirt. And once that question lands, it multiplies. How many blocks were raised? How many former entrances became basement walls? How many records describe the engineering but not the loss? How many older surfaces survive one layer down? Not ancient maybe, but old enough to expose how dramatically a city can rewrite itself while pretending continuity.
This is where Richmond stops looking like a single mystery and starts looking like part of a wider pattern. Across older cities, people keep finding the same visual grammar: buried windows, lower floors swallowed by sidewalks, vaulted spaces extending beneath the street, staircases descending to what feels like a previous public level. Officially, the explanations vary: street raising, flood mitigation, sewer work, fire recovery, commercial remodeling. All of those things happened, sometimes all at once. But what makes Richmond especially powerful is that the city already comes with documented conditions that favor burial. Flood-prone lowlands, a creek that once meandered through the valley and was later enclosed, canals altered and partly filled, reconstruction after destruction, industrial expansion, highway construction that literally buried historic foundations. This is not a place where vertical displacement would be surprising. It is a place where vertical displacement should be expected. And yet, most people are never taught to look for it. They are given neighborhood names, preservation plaques, restaurant guides, short summaries. But the lived physical logic of the place, the sense that one Richmond may still be sitting on top of another, gets softened, broken into specialties, handed off to archaeologists, planners, or obscure reports, contained. That containment is important, because once ordinary people begin seeing buried urban layers everywhere, they stop trusting the surface story. They start asking harder questions about what gets preserved, what gets celebrated, and what gets sealed. They start noticing that the same institutions that praise heritage also approved projects that cut through neighborhoods, erased communities, and covered foundational sites in concrete and fill. So when someone points to a full-height doorway below grade and says, "This looks like it belonged to an older street," the dismissive response comes fast. It is just a basement, just a vault, just old infrastructure. But the word "just" does a lot of work, because old infrastructure is still history. A buried street edge is still history. A sealed entrance is still evidence of a changed world. And if the modern city depends on people not feeling the weight of those changes, then minimization becomes its own kind of mask.
Richmond's lower architecture also intersects with something more human than engineering: memory loss. Not the dramatic kind, the civic kind. A city changes in increments: one flood, one rebuild, one raised grade, one demolished block, one new viaduct, one parking plan, one highway, one sealed creek, one buried foundation. After enough increments, the original logic becomes difficult to picture. People inherit the top layer and assume it was always the main one, until a curb appears below the current curb, until a doorway stands full height beneath a sidewalk, until the architecture itself begins contradicting the version of history you were taught to glide across.
And that is where this story stops being a story about old construction quirks and becomes a story about power. Because when you bury part of a city, you do not only change drainage or traffic, you change memory. You change what future people think is normal. You decide which level counts as the official city and which level gets recast as leftover space, service space, basement space, forgotten space. In Richmond, that matters more than almost anywhere. This is a city where the ground itself is politically charged. Commerce, enslavement, transport, flood, fire, industry, displacement, and redevelopment all collided in the same low districts. Some places were rebuilt quickly, some were repurposed, some were excavated, some were paved over. Some were buried so thoroughly that later generations encountered them as fragments, anomalies, rumors, or archaeological surprises. So when modern viewers see doorways facing a missing street, they are not only seeing a puzzle of architecture, they are seeing the physical aftermath of decisions. Who got to rebuild? Who got displaced? Which surfaces were raised? Which traces were preserved? Which histories were packaged for public comfort, and which ones were left in the dark below grade? That is why these details hit so hard online. People sense, even before they know the documents, that something is off. Human scale does not lie easily. A doorway built for regular street use carries intention in its proportions. Curbstones carry intention in their placement. When those intentions no longer match the visible city, the viewer feels rupture, and rupture creates the deepest kind of curiosity. Because the mind immediately jumps to the next question. If this much can remain visible in plain sight, what remains invisible? What sits behind sealed walls? What survives beneath later slabs? How many original surfaces still exist under modern grade in pockets across downtown? How many archival photographs would make the current city suddenly look like an upper deck? How much of Richmond's so-called lower level was once ordinary public ground before engineering, disaster, and development pushed the city upward? And here is the truly unnerving possibility. Maybe the strangest part is not that an older street level existed. Maybe the strangest part is how often people were trained not to notice. Not because there was one grand conspiracy with a single secret room and a single master plan. Cities are rarely that theatrical. The real mechanism is colder: bureaucracy, progress language, planning logic, selective commemoration, necessary infrastructure, the quiet conversion of visible history into background structure. Layer by layer, the buried city becomes normal, until someone looks down, sees a full-height doorway stranded below the present, and realizes normal may just be the newest cover story. So the next time you walk through downtown Richmond, do not just look at the facades that meet your eye. Look lower. Look where the brick changes color, where stone lines disappear into fill, where windows sit too deep, where thresholds make no sense, where curbs survive without a street, where a doorway still stands at full human height facing a route the modern city no longer admits. Because that doorway is doing more than opening into darkness. It is pointing backward. Backward to flood years and reconstruction. Backward to creek beds and canal lines. Backward to a time when the ground was different, the street was lower, and the city we know now may have been only the future layer waiting to be built on top. And once you accept that, Richmond changes. It stops feeling like a finished place. It starts feeling like evidence. Evidence that cities do not only preserve history, they edit it. They raise it, pave it, wall it in, redirect it, and sometimes bury it so completely that the survivors are mistaken for curiosities instead of witnesses. That is why these sunken entrances matter. They are witnesses, silent ones, architectural ones, the kind that cannot speak but can still testify. They testify that a street once ran where no street runs now. They testify that people once entered at a level now treated as below ground. They testify that downtown Richmond still carries the outline of an earlier city under the official one. And maybe that is the real reason these places haunt people. Not because they prove every extreme theory, but because they prove that the surface story is incomplete. Something was changed here. Something was covered. Something was lowered, or something above it was raised. And the marks of that transformation are still sitting in stone for anyone stubborn enough to notice. If you're the kind of person who cannot walk past a sealed arch, a buried window, or a vanished street line without needing to know what the city is hiding under its own feet, then you already understand why this matters. You are not just watching old mysteries. You are learning how to see the layer beneath the lie. And in places like Richmond, once you learn to see that layer, you start realizing the buried city may not be gone at all. It may be waiting, one doorway at a time, for the right people to remember where the street used to be.